You know, when we look at a map of the world, we see 194 countries.
Right. All neatly defined.
Yeah, defined by these very stark, permanent-looking geographical lines, borders drawn across mountains, rivers, and deserts.
Absolutely. And for most of human history, those lines meant something completely absolute.
Exactly. I mean, crossing that line meant stepping into a different world with different rules, different money, and a guard demanding a tax just for the privilege of showing up with goods to sell.
Because the border was historically dual purpose. It was a physical barrier for security, sure, but equally, it was an economic fortress.
Right.
It was a mechanism for a sovereign power to protect domestic industries from foreign competition while, generating revenue through tariffs.
But stepping into the modern arena of international business, you realize something incredibly counterintuitive is happening.
Oh, entirely counterintuitive.
Those lines on the map, they're still physically there. The border guards still check passports. Yet legally and economically, the unstoppable global trend is to systematically erase those lines.
Erase them completely.
Yeah, to make them entirely invisible for money, for goods, for services, and for human labor, which raises a massive paradox.
And it's a fascinating one.
Why would a sovereign nation, a country that fought hard for its independence and its borders, voluntarily tear down its own economic walls? I mean, who actually wins when those walls fall, and who gets left behind?
That tension is really the defining question of modern global economics, and it's the exact reason we are doing this deep dive today.
Exactly. And if you are listening to this, you are likely an MBA student preparing to navigate the incredibly complex terrain of regional economic integration.
And our objective here isn't just to help you pass a test.
Definitely not.
We are aiming to decode the invisible frameworks that dictate how global trade flows, how supply chains are optimized, and how multinational businesses actually structure their operations across different regulatory zones.
Consider this your ultimate strategic briefing. We are going straight to the core of economic integration theory.
Right, we're taking all the foundational concepts, the mathematical models of trade, the massive historical case studies, and breaking them all down.
So that you don't just memorize them, you internalize them. Because, if you're going to be advising a CEO on market entry or running a global supply chain, you have to understand the rule book.
We'll approach this analytically. Economic structures don't just appear out of thin air, right?
No, they definitely don't.
They are negotiated, compromised, and built over decades to solve specific problems. We'll look at the fundamental architecture of these agreements, climb the ladder of how countries integrate, and examine the sometimes surprising economic math.
The math that determines whether these agreements actually help or hurt the global economy.
Exactly. And ultimately, we'll analyze the complex webs of treaties navigated by massive economies like the European Union and India.
So, okay, let's unpack the baseline. When economists talk about economic integration, what is the actual mechanism here? Because we really need to move past the political buzzwords and look at the functional reality.
Well, at its most fundamental level, economic integration is the systematic removal of restrictions.
Okay.
It is neighboring countries or allied countries sitting down at a table and agreeing to eliminate the barriers impeding the trade of goods, the trade of services, and the movement of the factors of production.
And by factors of production, we primarily mean labor and capital, right?
Yes, human workers and money. The overarching objective of dismantling these restrictions is to artificially stimulate economic development and macroeconomic growth.
So it's essentially about removing friction.
Exactly, removing friction.
When you eliminate tariffs and quotas, you suddenly expose your domestic companies to foreign competition. And from a business strategy perspective, competition is the ultimate catalyst.
It forces innovation.
Right. Like, if I run a domestic company with a monopoly, I have zero incentive to innovate. But the second my country integrates with a neighbor and a foreign competitor can sell in my backyard without a penalty tax, I have a choice. Innovate or die.
That's simple.
That forces me to pour money into research and development, leading to process innovation, new technologies, and ultimately vastly better outcomes for the person buying the product.
And that outcome is what economic theory refers to as consumer welfare.
It's consumer welfare. Okay.
It is the golden ticket of trade liberalization. When firms are forced to compete across borders, they ruthlessly pursue efficiency. They attempt to reach what we call optimum plant size, maximizing the output of their labor and capital.
Wow, so they just scale up massively.
Exactly. Furthermore, when a region integrates and creates a larger frictionless market, it transforms into a massive magnet for foreign direct investment, or FDI.
Let's visualize that FDI magnet for a second.
Yeah.
Imagine you are an executive at a Japanese automaker. You are looking at two different regions in the world to build a new manufacturing plant.
Okay, lay it out.
Region A is 5 independent countries, each with a 20% tariff on the others. Region B is 5 countries that have fully integrated into a single economic zone with 0 internal tariffs.
Well, the investment decision makes itself.
It really does.
In Region A, you'd have to build 5 separate, smaller, inefficient factories to serve those 5 markets without paying the penalty tax. In Region B, you build one massive, hyper-efficient mega factory.
And you capture incredible economies of scale, and you ship your cars across all 5 countries seamlessly.
Right. That single investment boosts income, generates mass employment, and drives macroeconomic growth for the entire integrated bloc.
So to really understand how this architecture is built, we have to look at the theorists who drafted the blueprints. Jan Tinbergen is a critical name in this space, especially for the exam.
Yes, Tinbergen is foundational. He defined economic integration as creating the most desirable structure of the international economy.
And he said you do that by removing artificial hindrances and deliberately introducing elements of coordination.
That's right. His profound contribution was categorizing this process into 2 distinct phases: negative integration and positive integration.
Which, honestly, the terminology can be a bit of a psychological trap.
It really can.
In everyday language, negative implies a detriment and positive implies a benefit. But in economic theory, that is entirely incorrect. We are using these terms in a mathematical sense.
Mathematical sense, exactly. Subtraction and addition.
Let's build an analogy to lock this in. Think of national economies like separate, overgrown gardens. Negative integration is simply pulling the weeds.
Pulling the weeds out.
Yeah, you are subtracting the bad stuff. The tariffs, the restrictive quotas, the discriminatory border taxes. You aren't building anything new yet.
Right.
You are just removing the artificial hindrances that are choking the natural cross-border flow of commerce.
Pulling the weeds is a highly effective way to visualize the subtraction of obstacles. It is the initial necessary step. But a cleared patch of dirt isn't the ultimate goal. That brings us to positive integration, which is additive. This involves modifying existing policies and actively creating new institutions to coordinate markets.
So this is the diplomatic heavy lifting.
Yes, where countries sit down and say, well, we've removed the tariffs, but now we need shared rules of the game. We need a harmonized environmental standard so our factories compete on a level playing field. We need a shared central banking protocol.
Sticking with our analogy, if negative integration is pulling the weeds, positive integration is neighboring countries coming together to construct a massive shared greenhouse.
I love that. A shared greenhouse.
They are pooling their resources to build shared infrastructure, installing a centralized climate control system, and agreeing on the precise temperature they want to maintain. They are actively and deliberately introducing coordination.
You absolutely need both the subtraction of barriers and the addition of shared frameworks to achieve deep integration. Now, complementing Tinbergen is the work of Bella Balassa.
Right, particularly his influential 1969 analysis.
Yes. Balassa observed integration and concluded that it cannot be defined singularly. He argued it is a duality. He said it's both a process and a state of affairs.
A process and a state of affairs. Let's break down the practical difference between the two.
Sure. When Balassa calls integration a process, he is referring to the active, evolving measures that gradually eliminate discrimination between nations.
So it's the verb.
Exactly, the verb. It is the 10-year transition period written into a treaty where tariffs are lowered by 2% every year. It is the ongoing diplomatic negotiations, the late-night summits, the incremental adjustments.
The journey of removing the barriers. It's like the baking of the cake.
Yes, baking the cake.
Yeah.
Conversely, integration as a state of affairs is the noun. It is the destination.
Okay.
When you stand at the border between France and Germany today and observe trucks rolling across at highway speeds without stopping, you are observing the absolute absence of discrimination. You are witnessing a state of affairs.
So the cake is on the table, fully baked and ready to eat. Balassa says it's both the baking and the cake itself. Tinbergen says it's weed pulling and greenhouse building. Understanding these dualities provides a highly sophisticated lens for analyzing international treaties.
And you need that lens. Because as we all know from observing global politics, sovereign nations don't just wake up on a Tuesday and decide to build a massive, complex greenhouse together.
Right. It requires staggering amounts of political capital, trust, and alignment.
Building on that reality, countries generally edge into these relationships through a very specific progression. Economic theory maps this out as an integration ladder.
And this ladder is foundational knowledge.
Each rung you climb requires a deeper commitment, demands a greater sacrifice of national sovereignty, and theoretically unlocks vastly greater economic rewards.
If you're analyzing a market, you have to know what rung of the ladder that market is standing on. There are 5 distinct types of integration, moving from the loosest arrangement to the tightest.
A guaranteed exam question, by the way.
Let's start at the absolute baseline, rung 1, preferential trade arrangements or PTAs.
PTAs represent the oldest and most basic mechanism of economic cooperation. In a preferential trade arrangement, member nations agree to simply lower the barriers to trade for each other relative to what they charge non-member nations.
And the operative word there is lower.
Yes, lower. They do not eradicate the tariffs. They simply offer their partners a discount.
Got it. So if I am country A and my standard global tariff on imported machinery is 10%, I might sign a PTA with my ally, country B, and offer them a preferential rate of 5%.
Exactly.
The wall is still there, it's just a bit shorter for my friends. Historically, the classic example is the British Commonwealth Preference Scheme established in 1932.
And that 1932 scheme is a fascinating piece of economic history. Following the Great Depression, global trade was collapsing.
Right.
The UK decided to reduce tariffs on imports from its vast network of Commonwealth members nations like Canada, Australia, and India, while keeping a high tariff wall against the rest of the world.
It was a strategic maneuver to stimulate internal trade within their political sphere of influence, creating a massive, somewhat insulated economic bloc.
Precisely. It's the easiest rung to reach. Because a nation isn't surrendering its fundamental right to tax, it is merely adjusting the dials.
That sets the baseline. Rung 1 is the PTA lowering barriers. Rung 2 is where the dynamics shift significantly. Free trade areas or FTAs.
In a free trade area, member countries take a definitive leap. They completely remove the trade barriers among themselves. Zero tariffs, zero quotas on goods moving between the member nations. The internal friction is gone.
But there's a massive catch, right? A structural characteristic that defines the FTA and separates it from deeper forms of integration.
The defining characteristic is external independence. In an FTA, while internal trade flows freely, each individual nation retains absolute sovereignty to maintain its own independent tariff rates against the rest of the world.
So they do not share an external wall.
Exactly, they do not.
Let's ground this in a real supply chain scenario. Let's look at the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, which is now USMCA, but the mechanics remain the same. The US, Canada, and Mexico form a free trade area.
Okay.
Inside that bubble, goods move without tariffs. But let's say Japan wants to export steel to North America. Canada might decide they want cheap steel for construction, so they set their external tariff on Japanese steel at 2%.
And the United States.
While the U.S., wanting to protect its domestic steel workers in Pennsylvania, sets its tariff on Japanese steel at 25%.
You've immediately hit upon the central administrative nightmare of the free trade area.
It's a huge problem.
If Canada charges 2% and the U.S. charges 25%, what stops a massive logistics conglomerate from shipping millions of tons of Japanese steel into Vancouver, paying the negligible 2% tax, loading it onto a train, and driving it straight into the United States completely tariff-free, bypassing the U.S. protectionist wall?
It's the ultimate geographic loophole. You just route every single product on Earth through the member country with the lowest external tariff.
Right.
It would completely undermine the trade policy of the other members.
Which is precisely why free trade areas require an incredibly complex bureaucratic apparatus known as rules of origin.
Rules of origin?
Yes. To move a product from Canada to the U.S. tariff-free, you have to definitively prove that the product fundamentally originated within the FTA. You have to prove it's actually a Canadian product, not a disguised Japanese product.
And in modern manufacturing, where a single car might have parts from 30 different countries, proving origin is a monumental task.
It creates a staggering burden of paperwork, certificates, and audits. Companies spend millions just tracking the percentage of local value add to ensure they qualify for the zero tariff benefit.
That sounds incredibly tedious.
It is. But despite this friction, FTAs are wildly popular. Examples include IFTA in Europe, NAFTA, of course, the Southern Common Market, or SCM, and the Latin American Integration Association.
Nations love them because they capture the growth of regional free trade without surrendering the political power to dictate their own global trade policy.
They want the economic kick, but they want to eat it on their own terms.
But if you want to eliminate that massive administrative burden, the rules of origin nightmare, you have to climb to rung 3, the customs union.
A customs union resolves the loophole by taking the features of an FTA's zero internal barriers and adding a profound new requirement. All member nations must adopt a harmonized, common external trade policy against the rest of the world.
Returning to our steel example, in a customs union, Canada, the US, and Mexico would be forced to sit down and agree on a single, unified tariff rate for Japanese steel.
Right. Let's say they agree on 10%.
Now, it doesn't matter if the steel lands in Vancouver, Los Angeles, or Veracruz. The tax is 10%. The loophole is closed, and the complex rules of origin paperwork vanishes.
The administrative efficiency gained is massive, but the political cost is equally huge.
Because they give up control.
Exactly. By forming a customs union, a sovereign nation completely surrenders its independent trade policy. A country can no longer unilaterally lower tariffs to secure a geopolitical alliance with a third party. They have to negotiate every global trade deal as a unified bloc.
And the prime historical example of this is the 1957 formation of the European Common Market, the precursor to the modern EU.
It's a unified fortress. The internal walls are gone, and everyone guards the same outer wall.
Yet we are only on rung 3. There's a deeper level of integration. Rung 4 is the common market. What distinguishes a common market from a customs union?
A common market possesses all the traits we just discussed: free internal trade of goods, a common external tariff, plus a revolutionary addition: the free movement of the factors of production among member nations.
The factors of production? We are talking about human beings and capital.
Yes. This is where integration shifts from moving boxes of goods to moving the very engines of an economy.
How so?
Well, in a customs union, a German engineering firm can export industrial turbines to France without a tariff. But in a common market, that same German firm can open a branch in Paris, freely transfer millions of euros in capital across the border without financial controls, and legally relocate hundreds of German engineers to live and work in France without requiring a single visa or work permit.
Wow. From the perspective of a CEO managing a multinational footprint, the distinction between an FTA and a common market completely rewrites your corporate strategy.
Completely rewrites it. If you are operating a tech company in a free trade area, you can easily sell your hardware across borders, but your talent acquisition is restricted.
Right.
If you have a severe shortage of software developers in your U.S. headquarters, you cannot simply transfer your brilliant developers from your Mexican office. You are bottlenecked by immigration quotas, H-1B visas, and immense legal friction.
So your supply chain for physical goods is optimized, but your supply chain for human capital is broken.
Precisely. But operating within a common market like the European Union, a CEO treats multiple sovereign nations almost exactly as a single domestic market. You optimize your talent pool dynamically.
So if you face a labor shortage in Munich,
You recruit directly from Madrid or Milan. You need to raise massive capital. You issue bonds that are seamlessly purchased by pension funds across the entire bloc. The common market unlocks the true potential of the enterprise.
which brings us to the zenith, the final rung on the ladder, rung 5, economic union. I mean, if goods, services, labor, and capital are all flowing freely, what is left to integrate?
An economic union is the absolute highest form of integration. It encompasses everything in a common market, but demands the ultimate sacrifice of national sovereignty: the harmonization of macroeconomic policy.
Meaning what, exactly?
Specifically, member nations agree to share monetary and fiscal policies.
We are talking about surrendering the printing press and the national budget. A single currency managed by a single central bank setting one interest rate combined with coordinated taxation and government spending frameworks.
A historical example is the Benelux Union, formed by Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg post-WWII. But to conceptualize a functioning economic union, look at the United States.
That makes sense.
50 distinct political entities with the free movement of everything, a common external border, and one central bank, the Federal Reserve, managing a single currency.
The European Union's ultimate stated goal is to achieve full economic union status. But their current reality highlights how incredibly dangerous it is to only go halfway.
The Eurozone is the perfect cautionary tale. They successfully integrated their monetary policy. 19 countries share the euro, managed by the European Central Bank. But they never fully integrated their fiscal policy. They don't share a centralized treasury or uniform tax laws.
It's the equivalent of a married couple sharing a joint checking account, but maintaining totally separate, secret credit cards.
That structural flaw was violently exposed during the European debt crisis. You had countries like Greece running massive fiscal deficits, spending heavily and taxing poorly while relying on the strength of the euro, which was anchored by fiscally conservative countries like Germany.
Right. Because Greece couldn't devalue its own currency to escape the debt, the entire union was thrown into an existential crisis.
Exactly. It proves that climbing to the top rung of the integration ladder requires an all-or-nothing commitment.
The progression is super clear. PTA is lower barriers. FTA is zero internal barriers, independent external. Customs union is zero internal, shared external. Common market, you add free movement of labor and capital. Economic union, you add shared currency and fiscal policy.
That's the perfect summary for the exam.
Now, all of this sounds inherently beneficial. Removing barriers seems like a net positive for global prosperity, but moving into the deeper economic theory, we encounter a massive, counterintuitive bombshell.
Oh, this is my favorite part.
Economic models actually prove that joining a customs union can, under specific conditions, actively harm the global economy.
It is one of the most vital, nuanced concepts in international economics. The foundational theory was propounded by Jacob Viner in 1950 and subsequently refined by brilliant economists like Mead, Lipsey, Johnson, and Bhagwati.
Crucial names to remember.
Yes. Viner realized that while a customs union is a step toward free trade internally, it remains a discriminatory bloc externally. And depending on the efficiency of the countries involved, the union can result in either trade creation, which boosts global welfare, or trade diversion, which degrades it.
Let's construct a highly tangible scenario to visualize Viner's math. No abstract A, B, and C's. Let's talk about the global supply chain for solar panels.
Okay, let's do it.
Imagine 3 countries. Country 1 is a developing nation trying to build a green energy grid. We'll call them the consumer nation.
Got it.
Country 2 is a neighboring nation, a regional ally of the consumer nation. They manufacture solar panels, but their technology is older and their factories are somewhat inefficient. It costs them $200 to produce a panel.
$200, okay.
Country 3 is a global tech superpower located across the ocean. They have hyper-efficient megafactories and advanced robotics. They can produce a vastly superior solar panel for just $125.
So the raw cost of absolute efficiency is clear. The superpower is at 125. The regional ally is at 200. The global market dictates that the superpower should supply the world.
Now let's introduce the baseline distortion. The consumer nation has a small, wildly inefficient domestic solar industry that costs $300 to make a panel. To protect these domestic jobs, the consumer nation imposes a massive 100% tariff on all imported solar panels.
Let's look at the prices facing a buyer in the consumer nation under this baseline tariff. Buying domestic costs $300. Importing from the regional ally costs $200, plus the 100% tariff, bringing the final price to $400.
Right.
Importing from the global superpower costs $125, plus the 100% tariff, bringing the final price to $250.
Even with a staggering 100% penalty tax, the sheer manufacturing brilliance of the global superpower allows them to offer the cheapest panel at $250. The consumer nation imports from the superpower.
And the world is functioning logically. The most efficient producer on Earth is supplying the good.
Now let's look at Viner's scenario 1, trade creation. Suppose the consumer nation decides to form a customs union with the global superpower. They erase the tariff between them.
The outcome is phenomenal. The 100% tax on the superpower vanishes. The price of their solar panel in the consumer nation drops from $250 down to its raw cost of $125.
This is pure trade creation. Consumers in the importing nation are thrilled. The price just plummeted, meaning they can build twice as many solar farms.
That massive spike in demand is the consumption effect.
Exactly. Furthermore, the terribly inefficient domestic producers who are charging $300 are wiped out. Capital and labor stop being wasted on bad domestic manufacturing and are reallocated. We have replaced high-cost, inefficient domestic production with low-cost, hyper-efficient partner production. It is a massive win for global resource allocation.
It is the textbook ideal. But let's reset the board back to the baseline and examine Viner's nightmare scenario, trade diversion.
Okay, resetting the board.
The consumer nation still has the 100% tariff. They are currently buying from the superpower for $250. Now, suppose the consumer nation makes a political decision. Instead of integrating with the superpower, they form a customs union with their neighbor, the mediocre regional ally.
Let's run the new numbers. The 100% tariff on the regional ally is erased, but the superpower is locked out of the union, so the 100% tariff on them remains.
The prices facing the buyer are now domestic is 300. Superpower is still taxed, base 125 plus tariff equals 250. Regional ally is tax-free. The price drops to their base cost of 200.
Look at the rational choice of the buyer now. They will stop buying from the superpower at 250 and start buying from the regional ally at 200.
And here's the devastating realization.
Yeah.
From the perspective of the buyer and the consumer nation, they are happy. The price dropped from 250 to 200. But zoom out and look at the entire global economy.
Right. Before the treaty, the world was utilizing the absolute best, most efficient producer on the planet, the superpower making panels for 125.
And after the treaty, production has shifted away from the genius innovator and handed over to the mediocre regional ally making panels for 200, purely because of a discriminatory tax loophole.
That is trade diversion. Low-cost imports from outside the union are artificially replaced by high-cost imports from a union member.
You have quite literally forced the global economy to become less efficient. You are subsidizing an inefficient ally at the expense of global technological progress. Viner proves mathematically that if a customs union creates more trade diversion than trade creation, the union actually shrinks overall global welfare.
You form a free trade bloc, and the world actually gets poorer. It's a staggering strategic insight.
It really is.
So if I am a government minister analyzing a potential treaty, how do I predict which outcome will happen? How do I guarantee trade creation?
Well, economic history provides 4 vital conditions that maximize the probability of a successful welfare-enhancing customs union.
Okay, let's hear them.
Condition 1, short geographical distance between members.
The logistics reality. Even if a country halfway across the world is slightly more efficient at manufacturing, shipping heavy industrial goods across oceans burns capital and carbon. Integrating with a neighbor naturally maximizes the efficiency of your supply chain.
Condition 2, high pre-union trade volume. If 2 countries are already conducting massive amounts of trade, despite having high tariffs against each other, it proves their economies are fundamentally complementary.
Right. So removing the artificial barriers will simply supercharge an already efficient organic relationship.
Yes. If you have to force the trade to happen through a treaty, it's likely trade diversion.
Condition 3 is fascinating. Large union size.
It's a game of statistical probability. The larger the economic bloc, the higher the mathematical chance that the bloc natively contains the absolute most efficient global producer of any given good.
That makes total sense.
If your union encompasses half the global economy, you probably have the global superpower of solar panels, the global superpower of microchips, and the global superpower of agriculture already inside your walls. Therefore, internal free trade will almost always result in trade creation.
And the final condition, condition 4, high pre-union trade barriers. If the walls were incredibly high, tearing them down unleashes a massive coiled spring of pent-up economic potential.
Short distance, existing high trade volume, massive scale, and high initial barriers. If those 4 conditions are met, the customs union will almost certainly benefit the globe.
Now, Viner's mathematical models, the price of the solar panels dropping on day 1, that deals with what we call static gains, a one-time adjustment in the market.
Right.
But the true power of economic integration isn't a one-time price drop. It's the compounding long-term evolutionary pressure it puts on an economy. These are the dynamic gains.
The static gains are a photograph, the dynamic gains are a movie. They alter the fundamental trajectory of how corporations operate, how they invest, and how they innovate over decades. And we can categorize these into 4 massive systemic shifts.
The first dynamic gain is violently increased competition,
which we touched on with the innovator die concept, but let's look at the mechanism. Tariffs act as a protective blanket for lazy domestic monopolies.
Right. If I am the only telecom provider in a small country with a 50% tariff on foreign competitors, my customer service can be atrocious, my networks can be slow, and I will still make billions.
But the moment my country joins a common market, that protective blanket is ripped away. Suddenly, aggressive, highly capitalized telecom giants from neighboring countries flood my market. I can no longer survive on sheer dominance.
The misuse of monopoly power to extract wealth from consumers is destroyed. To survive, that telecom company has to rapidly invest in 5G infrastructure, slash prices, and improve service. The union acts as an antitrust enforcement mechanism simply through the power of open borders.
which leads to the second dynamic game, economies of scale.
For anyone studying corporate strategy, economies of scale are the holy grail. It's the principle that as you increase the volume of production, the cost to produce each individual unit drops.
Exactly. Your fixed costs, the billion-dollar R&D budget, the massive factory lease, are spread over millions of units instead of thousands.
But there is a ceiling to this. To achieve massive economies of scale, you require a massive market. If you manufacture specialized medical imaging equipment, and your domestic country only has 10 million people, you will saturate your market before you ever reach peak manufacturing efficiency. Your factory will run at half capacity.
But if your country joins an economic union, suddenly your domestic frictionless market expands from 10 million people to 400 million people.
Wow, that's huge.
The historical record is full of examples, particularly mid-sized European nations like the Netherlands and Belgium. Their domestic markets were far too small to support globally competitive heavy industry.
But by accessing the entire European common market, their factories could finally run at 100% capacity, lowering unit costs to a level where they could compete globally against American and Chinese titans.
The integration provided the springboard for global scale. Dynamic gain number 3 is stimulated investment. When you create a massive, highly competitive market, the stakes are raised. Companies realize that small, incremental changes won't capture market share. They're forced to make massive capital investments in branding, supply chain logistics, and next-generation R&D.
And as we discussed earlier, it triggers a tidal wave of foreign direct investment. The union becomes a geopolitical safe haven for capital. Outside corporations rush to build infrastructure inside the walls to access the vast consumer base tariff-free.
All of which culminates in the final dynamic gain, sustained economic growth. It is a compounding flywheel.
A flywheel, like that.
Increased competition forces innovation. Expanded markets unlock economies of scale. Scale and competition attract massive investment. That investment builds new factories, which requires immense labor.
And factor mobility allows workers to move to where the capital is, driving up employment, driving up wages, and increasing the overall wealth of the bloc, which in turn drives higher consumer demand, starting the cycle all over again. That flywheel is the ultimate promise of economic integration. We spent a lot of time on theory Weiner's math, the integration ladder, the dynamic flywheels. Let's take all of these theoretical frameworks and apply them to the most ambitious, complex, and sometimes chaotic economic experiment in human history.
Let's look at the European Union.
The European Union is an absolute marvel of political and economic engineering. It represents 28 European nations, and for the purposes of historical and academic modeling, we often freeze that number at 28, covering a vast portion of the continent, operating at the absolute bleeding edge of the integration ladder.
To understand the architecture of the EU, you have to understand the psychology of its foundation. This project wasn't initiated by a group of logistics executives trying to optimize supply chains to save 2% on shipping.
No, it was forged in the fires of profound continental trauma.
Exactly. The historical roots of the European project lie directly in the smoldering ruins of the Second World War. For centuries, European nations had been trapped in a cycle of devastating conflict, culminating in a war that annihilated millions and leveled entire cities.
The fundamental driving thesis behind the creation of the early Union was entirely about conflict prevention.
Yes, the theory of peace through economic entanglement. If you take the core industries required to wage war, specifically coal and steel, and you deeply intertwine them between historical enemies like France and Germany, you make it physically and economically impossible for them to build weapons against each other.
Because if Germany relies on French steel and France relies on German coal, war becomes mutual suicide.
It was a brilliantly pragmatic strategy. The timeline highlights this rapid push. Following the split of the Cold War, Western Europe began organizing. 1949 saw the Council of Europe.
But the critical economic milestone was 1958, with the creation of the European Economic Community, initiated by what we call the Original Six.
The vanguard. Belgium, Germany, France, Italy, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. They started climbing the ladder we discussed earlier.
And they climbed rapidly. By 1968, they had achieved the free mobility of industrial goods. By 1970, they achieved a common market by removing restrictions on the movement of labor and capital.
But amid all this industrial progress, there is a massive anomaly that often confuses observers.
Oh, farming.
Yes, the EU spends an astronomical portion of its budget and political energy on farming, the Common Agricultural Policy, or the CAP. In an era of high-tech manufacturing and digital services, why is agriculture such a guarded pillar of the European Union?
Again, it comes down to the trauma of the 1940s. During and immediately following WWII, Europe experienced catastrophic food shortages, rationing, and genuine starvation.
So the architects of the EU recognized that a nation cannot be secure if it cannot feed its own people. Food security was elevated to the exact same level of importance as military security.
Right. The Common Agricultural Policy wasn't designed purely for economic efficiency. It was designed as an absolute safety net.
The goals of the CAP are incredibly multifaceted. It is an immense, complex web of subsidies and regulations designed to ensure that farmers produce sufficient quantities of food regardless of global market fluctuations.
It shields them from the extreme price volatility caused by unpredictable weather. It provides capital grants to modernize farming equipment, ensuring Europe remains agriculturally advanced.
Furthermore, it serves a profound sociological purpose. The CAP is designed to sustain viable rural communities. Without it, raw market forces would drive the entire population into megacities, leaving the countryside economically desolate.
It maintains jobs in the broader food industry and increasingly is being leveraged to enforce strict environmental protections and animal welfare standards. It is inefficient by pure market standards, but highly effective at achieving its political goals.
While the CAP handles the land, the true crown jewel of the EU, the thing that transformed the continent, is the single market.
The single market is the realization of the state of affairs Balassa described. It is the legal and physical reality where goods, services, capital, and humans move across national borders with the same frictionless ease as moving between neighborhoods in a single city.
We discussed the theory of increased competition, but the single market provides the staggering real-world evidence. When the EU broke up national monopolies, consumer welfare skyrocketed.
Telecommunications is a prime example of this.
Making a cross-border phone call in Europe used to be exorbitantly expensive because national telecoms gouged consumers. The single market shattered those monopolies and prices plummeted.
The aviation sector experienced a similar revolution. National flag carrier airlines used to dominate the skies with artificially high fares. The single market allowed low-cost carriers to operate anywhere in Europe, dropping airfares radically and opening up hundreds of new routes between smaller cities.
It fundamentally changed how Europeans travel and do business. European businesses suddenly had unrestricted, tariff-free access to nearly 500 million affluent consumers.
That scale is what allows European conglomerates to compete with the sheer size of the American or Chinese domestic markets. And structurally, this deep entanglement acts as a massive shock absorber during a crisis.
During a severe economic recession, the historical instinct of a sovereign nation is to panic and throw up protectionist walls, tariffs, and quotas to protect domestic jobs. This is known as beggar thy neighbor economics, and it inevitably triggers a trade war that deepens the recession for everyone.
Because EU nations are legally bound to the single market, they are structurally prevented from deploying those self-destructive tariffs. They are forced to weather the storm together, maintaining the vital flow of trade when it is needed most.
Okay, the economic benefits are clear. But practically speaking, how on earth do you govern this? We are talking about 28 sovereign nations with different languages, wildly different cultures, and conflicting domestic priorities.
How do you actually pass a law that applies to a Finnish tech worker and a Greek fisherman simultaneously? Understanding the EU's institutional framework is critical for analyzing how massive geopolitical entities function, especially for this MBA exam.
The governance structure is entirely unique. It is neither a traditional international organization nor a single federal state. It relies on a delicate balance of power across 5 main pillars. Let's map this out using a corporate structure analogy. First, you have the European Parliament. Think of them as the representatives of the shareholders.
The citizens. The Parliament is directly elected by the people of the EU. They are the democratic voice, holding legislative, supervisory, and vital budgetary responsibilities.
Precisely. Second, you have the European Council. This is the board of directors. It consists of the heads of state, the presidents and prime ministers of the member nations.
So they don't deal with the small stuff.
They do not get bogged down in the minutiae of everyday lawmaking. Their role is to define the grand strategy, the ultimate political direction, and the high-level priorities of the bloc.
So the people vote for parliament, and the national leaders form the European Council to set the vision. What's the third pillar?
The third is the Council of the European Union. And yes, the similarity in names is a constant source of confusion.
Yeah, that's tricky.
If the European Council is the board of directors, This council is the meeting of the department heads. It represents the voice of the member governments at the ministerial level.
Okay, so if the EU is debating a new environmental regulation, the environmental ministers from all 28 countries convene here. They are heavily responsible for adopting EU laws and coordinating policies.
Exactly. Fourth pillar, the engine room. The European Commission. This is the executive C-suite.
The C-suite.
The Commission's mandate is vital. They are sworn to promote the general interest of the EU as a whole, not the interests of any individual member state. They hold the immense power of initiating and proposing new legislation.
Once a law is passed by the Parliament and the Council, the Commission is responsible for enforcing it, implementing policies, and managing the sprawling EU budget.
The Commission drafts the blueprint. The Parliament and the Council of the EU approve it. And to ensure the blueprint is followed.
The fifth pillar, the Court of Justice. They are the ultimate compliance department. Their role is to ensure that EU law is interpreted and applied uniformly across every single member state.
They arbitrate disputes between member countries and ensure that the EU institutions themselves are not overstepping their legal bounds.
It is an incredibly complex, slow-moving, yet undeniably resilient system. Parliament, European Council, Council of the EU, Commission, and the Court of Justice. The EU didn't just pull the weeds of negative integration, they engineered the most intricate, highly regulated economic greenhouse in human history.
And while the EU represents the ultimate destination of integration, most of the world operates in a much more fluid, chaotic environment. Which brings us to a fascinating practical application of all this theory.
Right.
How does a massive, rapidly developing sovereign economy navigate this global web without surrendering its independence? Let's examine the strategic portfolio of international agreements maintained by India.
For an executive managing operations in South Asia, understanding India's treaty landscape is paramount. India doesn't just have one blanket policy, they execute a highly nuanced, asymmetrical diplomacy.
They tailor their integration strategy based entirely on who they are sitting across the table from.
Exactly. We can categorize these treaties into strategic buckets to understand the underlying logic. Let's look at the first bucket, the neighborhood buffer.
India is a geopolitical titan in its immediate region. When negotiating with much smaller neighbors, the treaties reflect a strategy of managed integration. Let's look at the Agreement on Trade, Commerce, and Transit with Bhutan, implemented in 2006.
The baseline is establishing free trade, but there is a glaring exception in the treaty that seems counterintuitive. It explicitly allows Bhutan to impose non-tariff restrictions on the importation of Indian goods.
Why would the dominant power agree to let the smaller power restrict its exports?
It is a calculated acknowledgement of extreme economic asymmetry. If India demanded absolute unfettered free trade, the sheer scale of Indian manufacturing would instantly obliterate Bhutan's nascent domestic industries.
By allowing Bhutan to maintain specific limited protections, India helps its neighbor develop a stable, industrialized economy, which ultimately creates a richer trading partner and a more stable political border.
We see an even deeper version of this strategy in the revised Treaty of Trade with Nepal from 2009.
Yes, the Nepal Treaty goes beyond just allowing protections. It mandates active assistance. While it abolishes basic customs duties on mutually agreed imports, it explicitly requires the government of India to actively promote industrial development in Nepal through financial grants and special favorable treatments.
It is the larger economy intentionally subsidizing the smaller neighbor to build regional stability. The treaties also act as a pressure release valve.
The Nepal Treaty includes an escape hatch, allowing either nation to freeze trade to protect national security, public morals, or to prevent a health crisis.
Moving outward from the immediate neighborhood, we encounter India's second strategic bucket, the Asian networks. These are multilateral and highly strategic bilateral agreements focused on rapid growth and tech integration.
A foundational agreement here is APTA, the Asia-Pacific Trade Agreement, which traces its roots back to 1975. The core membership includes massive demographic and manufacturing hubs, Bangladesh, China, India, and the Republic of Korea.
APTA is a brilliant example of BALAS's integration as a process. It didn't start as a massive common market. It started as a simple mechanism for tariff reduction among developing nations.
But as these economies modernized, the treaty evolved. By the 2007 negotiations in Goa and the 2009 framework in Seoul, they weren't just talking about tariffs on textiles anymore.
They were expanding the agreement to cover trade facilitation, the service sector, and cross-border investment protocols.
Similarly, India's engagement with ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, through the 2003 Comprehensive Economic Cooperation Agreement signed in Bali, demonstrates a methodical approach to a powerhouse region.
It established a framework for gradual, scheduled tariff elimination, moving toward a free trade area, while carefully allowing both sides to designate sensitive areas, critical domestic industries, shielded from immediate competition.
But the strategy shifts radically when India negotiates bilaterally with highly advanced, knowledge-based economies. Look at the Comprehensive Economic Cooperation Agreement with Singapore.
With Singapore, the conversation isn't about protecting nascent manufacturing. It is a highly modernized treaty focused heavily on capital flow, investment predictability, and intellectual property.
The treaty dives deep into intellectual property rights, including complex protections for specialized plant varieties, and establishes frameworks for joint science and technology cooperation.
You see a similar high-level strategic alignment in the Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, or CEPA, with South Korea. They aren't just lowering taxes on cars, they are actively rewriting the rules of corporate competition.
Key articles to memorize here. Article 6.9 addresses monopoly and exclusive service suppliers, binding both nations to prevent anti-competitive business practices. Article 6.11 locks in protections guaranteeing that neither nation will initiate aggressive safeguard actions against the other's service sector.
And perhaps the most strategically loaded treaty is the CEPA with Japan. The text itself notes that this agreement was forged with an eye toward dynamic and rapidly changing global strategic challenges.
That is diplomatic code for acknowledging the shifting geopolitical power balances in Asia. The treaty with Japan is as much about shared values and systemic alignment as it is about moving products.
It legally demands domestic transparency in Article 4, addresses mutual anti-corruption frameworks in Article 7, mandates environmental protection standards in Article 8, and ensures strict compliance with WTO obligations in Article 22.
The contrast is striking. With Nepal, India negotiates grants to build basic factories. With Japan, India negotiates complex anti-corruption and environmental harmonization. It demonstrates immense strategic agility.
The final bucket of India's portfolio focuses on massive regional blocs. And the evolution of SAARC, the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, is a textbook example of climbing the integration ladder.
It started in 1991 with SFTA, the SAARC Preferential Trading Arrangement. Notice the P. It was just rung one. The goal was simply to ignite intra-regional trade by lowering tariffs and providing special duty-free access for the absolute poorest member states.
But the process evolved into SAFTA, the South Asia Free Trade Area, moving from preferential to free. They established hard mathematical targets for tariff reduction across the bloc.
Specifically 20% for non-least developed and 30% for least developed states. And they moved into positive integration territory, actively agreeing to harmonize standards and simplify complex customs procedures under Article 8.
And SAFTA contains one of the most fascinating mechanisms we've seen. If you are a deeply impoverished nation, your government likely relies heavily on the tariffs you collect at the border just to pave roads and fund schools.
Right.
Joining a free trade area means zeroing out those tariffs, essentially bankrupting the national treasury. SAFTA actually engineered a formal mechanism under Article 11 to financially compensate the least developed member countries for that loss of custom revenue.
It is an incredible acknowledgement that true integration requires shared sacrifice and wealth redistribution to remain stable.
Finally, India stretches its influence across the globe with its preferential trade agreement with Mercosur, the massive Latin American bloc comprising Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay.
Mercosur is an agricultural and resource titan. This agreement operates on a very pragmatic system of offer lists. It's not a blanket free trade zone. It is a highly negotiated exchange of specific comparative advantages.
India looks at Mercosur and says, we will lower tariffs on your essential oils, your plastics, and your agricultural products. In exchange, Mercosur lowers tariffs on Indian pharmaceuticals, electrical machinery, and chemicals.
Analyzing this complete portfolio reveals a masterclass in global economic management. A massive nation like India does not simply adopt one ideology of integration.
They utilize a complex, interwoven network of PTAs, FTAs, and CEPAs to manage their immediate borders, attract advanced technology from Asia, and secure vital resources from Latin America, all while protecting their domestic sovereignty.
And that strategic reality brings us full circle. We have journeyed from the abstract definitions of Timbergen and Balassa, climbed the 5 rungs of the integration ladder, unpacked the counterintuitive math of trade diversion, explored the dynamic growth flywheels, analyzed the monumental architecture of the European Union, and mapped the strategic treaty network of a modern superpower.
If you are an MBA student, this material forms the bedrock of international strategy. Just to recap the key terms you need to nail for the exam: economic integration, preferential trade arrangements, free trade areas, custom unions, common markets, economic union, trade creation, and trade diversion.
The distinction between a free trade area and a common market isn't academic trivia. It is the fundamental data point that dictates where a multinational corporation builds its supply chains, how it allocates its capital, and how it sources its human talent.
We began the session by picturing a map of the world, defined by 194 stark, permanent borders. We've spent this deep dive exploring how the sheer force of economic gravity, the pursuit of efficiency, scale, and prosperity, is relentlessly eroding those lines.
It really is unstoppable.
But as we conclude, I want to leave you with a profound, lingering question. A question the economic models cannot fully answer, but one that will define the political reality of the next century.
I love a good lingering question.
If the ultimate logical conclusion of all this economic integration is a totally frictionless globe, a world where capital, labor, goods, and services face absolutely zero barriers, does the very concept of a national economy eventually cease to exist?
Wow.
And if your money, your career, and your supply chains have absolutely no allegiance to a border, what ultimately happens to national identity? When the economic fortress walls fall completely, what is left to define the country inside?
A massive existential question for the future of global management.
Something to ponder before your next study session. Thanks for taking the deep dive with us. Good luck on the exam.